All right, we are continuing our series in the book of Ecclesiastes. And I mentioned to you last week we were together that I was not going to spend time on Ecclesiastes 3:1 through 10 because I had covered that in earlier broadcasts that have been posted to the channel, so you can go back and take a look at those. It was one broadcast for each phrase in chapter 3, 1 through 8. That leads us to some basic observations. And I think I cannot stress this enough when you study the scriptures, to note repetitive phrases or to note change of tenure or emphasis on language or different things like that. These help you to see the flow of the author's intention as directed by the Holy Spirit. The phrase "I know" is mentioned 2 times in verses 11 to the end of the chapter, as well as "I have seen" and "I said to myself." Now remember, most of the time when you are reading the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon is writing under the sun. He's writing about experiencing life apart from the relationship to God. And of course, that's where we get vanity of vanities, chasing after wind, the futility of living life. If this is all there is to life, then eat, drink, and be merry. And we will see that in chapter 3 again. It's a repeated cycle. But I want you to also note as we go through chapter 3, and I'll try to highlight it for you, how Solomon has a spiritual lucid moment, but then he slides back into seeing life under the sun. So Solomon kind of comes in and kind of goes out, but he leans more in the first 11 and a half chapters towards the frustration of trying to enjoy life apart from enjoying his relationship with God. Now, let's pull some insights here as we talk about this. The immediate context of verse 11 is verses 2 through 10. The contrasts of extreme ends of a continuous line, birth and dying, a time to plant, a time to harvest, a time to kill, to heal, to tear down, to build up, to weep, to laugh. These are extremes. If you were to draw a line and put each one of these at one end of the line, it shows an extreme between these two things. But it also validates a point of verse 11 where he has made everything appropriate for its time. So there is a time for birth, there is a time for death, there is a time to search, there is a time to give up loss, etc. And in verse 11, I want you to note how Solomon describes God. How Solomon describes God. He has made, referring to God, he has made everything appropriate in its time. So again, the affirmation, a time to love and a time to hate, the appropriateness of that. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning to the end. Well, let's make some observations here. He has made everything appropriate in its time. In the Hebrew, the word means beautiful, and I'm sure you have heard the familiar chorus that he makes all things beautiful. And this is the idea. Now, apart from recognizing the events in our life from God, nothing is beautiful. Nothing seems appropriate. Well, Rick, that seems like an extreme statement, but let me illustrate it this way. When something comes into your life that you were not expecting, it caught you off guard, you weren't prepared. When that something comes into your life, think about the, the, the phrase that you use most often. What's the phrase that you use most often? Why is this happening? That's the phrase, isn't it? And for many Christians, they'll say, why is God allowing this to happen? Apart from God, life is not beautiful. Life does not have meaning to it. There's not purpose. And when you don't have meaning and purpose, you don't have joy. You don't have peace. But with God, even as the Apostle Paul says repeatedly in the book of Philippians, we can rejoice in the Lord. Throughout the Psalms, you have that same phraseology. Rejoice in everything. It doesn't say rejoice for everything, but rejoice in everything. And the Christian has the confidence that God works all things together for good to those who love him and to those who have been called by him. So Solomon describes God in this lucid moment that he has made everything beautiful in its time. He also says God has set eternity in the hearts of men. Oftentimes you might hear, in particular, missionaries, or if you read any biographies of missionaries, they might refer to the concept of eternity in the hearts of man. In other words, that spiritual void of eternity that man tries to fill in all sorts of different ways. And we have seen in Solomon that he has tried to satisfy eternity in his heart through all of the projects from chapter 1 and chapter 2 that he set his mind to, that he set his hand to. Now, because there is eternity in the hearts of men, wanting to know what is coming, man's futility in understanding the works of God remains in them because they're searching for the meaning of eternity apart from God. That's what it says there in verse 11. Yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. Now, implied in this statement is man's limited understanding. He is finite. He has restrictions in what he can comprehend about God from the heavenly perspective. But it also testifies to the vastness of God's intellect, his wisdom, his complete knowledge of what he has created. Now, because man cannot understand the works of God, his attitude is, well, let me just enjoy work and life as a gift from God. This gift from God is the God of his limited understanding within his, if you please, own backyard. Look at it in verse 12. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is a gift of God. Well, certainly God gives that gift of work and life. He gave it to Adam and Eve in the garden before sin and after sin as well. Yes, it is a general gift from God to all mankind that they can find meaning and purpose in their work. They can find enjoyment at the accomplishment of their hands. And that is from God, because God is the one who gives the strength and gives the intelligence and the creativity to enter into and accomplish a work that the person sets his hands to. But again, this phrase is under the sun. It's under the sun. Now, Solomon asserts three truths about the work of God in verse 14. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it, and there is nothing to take away from it, for God has so worked that men should fear him. Now, what are the three truths regarding the work of God? First of all, his work is permanent. I know that everything God does will remain forever. Notice the word will. Not only present, but futuristic as well. His work is permanent. Notice the verse goes on to say, there is nothing to add to it. The work of God is complete. And then the work of God is secure. There is nothing to take from it. Now, pause for a moment and take these three truths about the work of God and relate them to the work of God in your salvation. Is your salvation permanent? Is your salvation complete? Is your salvation secure? And the answer scripturally is a resounding yes. Complete affirmation, yes, my salvation is permanent. I cannot lose it. He will not take it away from me. My salvation is complete. Colossians, I am complete in Christ. And then my salvation is secure. I'm in the hand of God, and no one can pluck me out from his hand. So the result should be that man should fear God. That's the rest of verse 14. For God has so worked that men should. See, it doesn't say that man does, but that man should. Man should recognize from the work of God who God is and the relationship that the creature can have to the Creator, and fear God. Fear not in a trembling sense of punishment, but fear of respect, fear of, if you please, awe, fear of living in such a way before God in a pleasing fashion. That's the concept of fear here. But again, the verb should is inserted here by the Spirit of God indicating this would be the logical outcome if somebody acknowledges the work of God, but they don't, and they will not fear God. I want you to notice the emphasis on the sovereignty of God in verse 15. That which is has been already, and that which will be has already been. For God seeks what has passed by. I believe this talks about the sovereignty of God. What has already been. What will already be. And God seeks what has passed by. God's complete control. And then in 16 and 17, Solomon observes man's perversions and how God will respond. Furthermore, I have seen under the sun that in the place of justice there is wickedness, and in the place of righteousness there is wickedness. And I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man for a time, for every matter, and for every deed there is. So Solomon says, God sees your perversions. God sees you twisting justice into unrighteousness. God sees your wickedness being twisted into unrighteousness. And God will judge both. God will judge both. Solomon, under the Spirit of God, is not elevating righteous man over the unrighteous man, but simply communicating that there will be a justice for both righteous and unrighteous for a time, for every matter, and for every deed there is. And then he gets a little bit fatalistic here. I said to myself, verse 18, concerning the sons of man, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. So the testing of man, the trials, the tribulations, the putting my hand to a project, and at the end, there's no satisfaction. There's no joy. There's no peace. There continues to be an inward drive of longing for something else, something better. All of this, according to Solomon, is a test from God to show that driven person trying to find everything in life apart from God, that you're nothing more than an animal. You're nothing more than a beast. That's what they do. That's what they do. And then he says in verse 19, for the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. Well, I thought I was superior to the animal kingdom. And Solomon says, in reality, you're not. Because Peanut's going to die and you're going to die. There is no difference between you and the animal kingdom. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over beast. For all is vanity. All go to the same place. All came from dust, and all return to dust. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? So, a couple of facts here. There is no difference between man and an animal when it comes to death. Second fact, both man and animal will return to dust because that's where they were taken from. So there's no advantage that the man has over the animal kingdom. And he's even uncertain about the eternity of man or beast. Does the spirit of man really go up? Does the spirit of the beast really go down? He doesn't know. He doesn't have any certainty. Now, I know we're talking pre-New Testament. However, his own father talked about not going to Sheol and being separated. And so his own father understood that beyond the grave there was a paradise where his spirit would go. But Solomon is under the sun here as he writes this. And so he is, if you please, blubbering about his uncertainty. And then the conclusion is in verse 22. I have seen that nothing is better than the man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. We've seen that before, right? Eat, drink, and be merry. But who will bring him to see what will occur after him? So, in other words, man should be happy because his life is all there is. And under the circumstances, what man can explain eternity to another man? What man living under the sun can explain to another man living under the sun about eternity? And the implied answer is they can't. We used to have a saying when I did full-time nouthetic or biblical counseling in trying to encourage the trainees. How can a unbeliever, referring to those in psychology and the medical community, how can an unbeliever explain to another unbeliever how to bring about lasting change? How can an unbeliever identify accurately and explain carefully the sinful lifestyle of another believer? They can't. And this is what the concluding verse says here in chapter 3. Now, man either lives under the sun or in the sun. I think this is a fairly good summation. Man either lives under the sun or in the sun, referring to the relationship to God. Let's do a contrast here. Under the sun, we've covered, 3 chapters. And here are the repeated phrases of desperation from Solomon, who is living under the sun. Emptiness, vanity, wearisome, grievous, pain, no profit. And again, if a person does not have a relationship to God through Christ, they are living under the sun. I don't care how successful they appear to be. I don't care how much money they have in their bank account. I don't care how much acreage they have. I don't care whether they have a home in Florida and one here in Pennsylvania. I don't care if they have 2 or 3 expensive cars on their property. I don't care if they have the latest armory and weapons in their house. I don't care about any of those things. If they are under the sun, they will not be satisfied. And these are words that you find in the first 3 chapters of Solomon. Every time he undertook a project, one of these phrases came up. What about in the sun? There's going to be peace. There's not going to be a restlessness. There's not going to be a wandering. There's going to be contentment. There's going to be an inner contentment of satisfaction and trust. Satisfaction, as I said, there's going to be fulfillment. There's going to be purpose. There's going to be meaning. Under the sun or in the sun. Man either lives under the sun or in the sun. Questions or thoughts from great listeners?
Solomon to do a turnaround.
I'm sorry, Pat?
What helps Solomon to do a turnaround?
You know, that's going to come in chapter 12, Pat.
Okay.
It's going to take him over a year to finally wake up. Yeah. We know people like that, don't we? Takes them a while to wake up. Yeah. Well, if there are no other thoughts or questions, Thursday night we start a new series on worship. Why don't you think about what worship is? Why don't you reflect back on your church upbringing and ask yourself, was that truly worship? Sunday morning, we will talk about Abel. By faith, Abel offered a better sacrifice. What are some things that we can learn from Abel for ourselves today? Because it says he still speaks from the grave. So his life and the truths that we can unearth are applicable today for ourselves. And then Sunday night, we will do the second eating disorder on bulimia. Bulimia.